Welcome and good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Graby, and I am the director of the Warren B. Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Service here at UNH Law. I'm so glad you are all able to join us today, and I'm so glad that the storm is holding off for a couple more hours. We've been watching that carefully all week. But it is my pleasure now to introduce you to Jerry Ann Bogus, who is the executive director of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, who will introduce our moderator and provide a little background about what we are going to be hearing today. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, and good morning. Hope you enjoyed your march and speeches that you came from so far. As he said, my name is Jerry Ann Bogus, and I'm the executive director of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. And we're really excited to be here in Concord because our work is to expand the trail beyond Portsmouth to be a statewide organization where we're telling the little-known stories of New Hampshire's Black history. And our bigger goal with telling these stories is really dialoguing around diversity and equity in our state and removing stereotypes. So that's our wider goal. You know, we want to change the world, right? One person at a time. This talk is made possible by a grant from the New Hampshire Humanities. So we thank them for doing that. Also the UNH School of Law and the Black Heritage Trail. So I'm really, really excited to have this talk here in Concord. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, discusses the unprecedented rise in U.S. incarceration over the past 30 years. She challenges us to think about mass incarceration as human rights crisis rooted primarily in our unresolved racial divisions, anxieties, resentment, stereotypes, rather than looking at just crime. So that's a big part of the work that we're doing is to take a look at history and see how that affects us today. I'm really excited that we have gathered a great group of people, including our moderator, who is Tanya Evans, Esquire. She's a professor of law at the University of New Hampshire School of Law. She's chair of the Intellectual Property and Technology online programs. She has experience in the area of intellectual property, new technologies, entrepreneurship, innovation, entertainment law, trustees of estates, and municipal finance. She writes, speaks, and teaches primarily about the intersection of copyright and new technologies as well as estate laws. So we're really excited to have her moderating our panel. If you could take a minute just to think about what you know about race and the law, what you think you know, how you know it, and just maybe write a sentence, I believe this is what I know about race and law, or I feel this is what I know. If you just write one statement before we start, I will pass it on because we'll ask you a follow-up question at the end of the program. So without much ado, I'll pass this on over to Tanya, to Professor Evans.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry Ann. We wanted you to take a look at, so let me make sure, don't go far, Jerry Ann. This is your computer. I'm not a Mac person. But I wanted to, first of all, escape, to show you a dynamic infographic that appeared online from the New York Times last year. And it is a very telling illustration of the impact of poverty on communities of color in particular, but Black boys in general, but Black boys in particular. Look at me. PC takes over a Mac. This is amazing. I don't know if you realize what you just witnessed. Under pressure as well. Right, so I'm going to have this dynamic infographic go on in the background. So in case you've not seen it, you can see. So the title of the recent New York Times article sets a startling reality. The extensive data shows punishing reach of racism for Black boys. And the best way to experience it, as I've said, is that this article online, if you've not already seen it, and it tracks the lives of 10,000 Black boys and white boys who grew up in rich families and shows the substantial and disparate results of next generation wealth. The article and dynamic infographic shows that most white boys raised in wealthy families will stay rich or upper middle class as adults, but black boys raised in similarly situated households will not. In the article, if you were to scroll down, and I encourage you to do so on your own, it goes on to show that the opposite is true for black boys and white boys raised in poor family households, that white boys are far more likely to penetrate that barrier of poverty within one generation. And yet black boys are trapped in either scenario with the likelihood of generational poverty. And that sets the stage for where we are today, because we know that generational poverty can also lead to generational interactions with law enforcement through economic crimes and folks feeling like they have no other choice but. And so oftentimes people focus on one or an individual, but you have to look at systemic interactions and the role that that plays over time. And so our fearless panelists will be exploring that on the other side of what it means for the impact of communities of color in the criminal justice system. We'll talk about the law or the history of law and punishment in New Hampshire in particular, the disproportionate incarceration rates of racial and ethnic minorities, the social impact of mass incarceration, the consequences of incarceration on communities of color, particularly in the Granite State, and intensifying surveillance and criminalization of poor and black communities. And also, because I'm very solutions-oriented, and all of our panelists are as well, what a shift from punitive to restorative justice within our criminal system could look like. And so as you continue to think about the role that law and economics play on this particular topic, hopefully we'll have more solutions at the end than questions. Briefly about our presenters, they'll tell you more about themselves. Unfortunately, Bill Celesters at the last minute could not be with us for a family emergency. We will begin with Devin Chafee, who is the executive director of the New Hampshire ACLU. Then we will hear remarks from the Honorable Dan Feltus, a member of the New Hampshire State Senate, and finally, Lieutenant Carlos Camacho, 16-year veteran of the Nashua Police Department. Each panelist will share about 10 minutes, 10 minutes please class, 10 minutes of remarks. So because the beauty of this interaction is we really want it to be a conversation, but we do want our panelists to set the stage and then open it up for conversation and what I hope will be a rich dialogue. I welcome you to our campus and to this community, and without further ado, I pass it along to Devin.
There we go. We'll keep that. We want reminders of the wonderful people who have brought us here today, right? Because this is such a fantastic event. I really want to thank Jerry Ann and the Black Heritage Trail and Kirsten and all the folks that really worked, Professor Grebe, all the folks that worked to pull this together and bring us this delightful tea to sit here and come and talk about an issue that is so incredibly important. And I'm very honored to be here today, honored to be here with folks like the senator and the lieutenant who have amazing experience and expertise in this area. I am sad that Mr. Celesters couldn't join us today. I have heard him speak before, and his story really is fantastic and amazing. And so I do encourage you, if you get the opportunity to hear him speak, or really if you get the opportunity to hear from someone directly who has been impacted by our criminal justice system, if you have that opportunity to hear them speak, I highly recommend that you take advantage of it, because I think it can be quite powerful. What I'm going to try to do in my remarks is really just start by setting a stage, a very broad framing for the issues that we're going to be talking about here today. And I want to start with what I think is just a very general message, which is, America, we have a very serious problem in our country. We are really experiencing a crisis of criminal justice in our country. How many of you know that, probably many of you may know, that the United States has the highest incarceration rates in the world? Raise a hand. All right, folks are keeping up. Folks are watching the news. But really, it's even more staggering that it's not as if we just have the highest rates. Our rates really dwarf the other countries' incarceration rates in the world. It's really, really quite staggering. We have less than 5% of the world's population, and yet we have almost 25% of the world's total prison population. So that's a total of a quarter of all of the world's prisoners are here within our country. And by the close of 2016, we had 2.2 million individuals in our country who were incarcerated, whether it's in our federal prisons, our state prisons, or in our local county and local jails. And this increase hasn't always been, right? It's not as if we started out our country with high rates of incarceration. And in fact, what we have seen is a real significant ballooning of our prison population in recent decades. So if you look at from 1971 to today, you see an increase of 400% in our incarcerated population here in the United States. So given that we know that this incarceration rate has ballooned so quickly in such a short period of time, it can't be that it always has to be this way, because it has not always been this way. And this rate of incarceration has continued to persist even though we have seen crime rates in this country decrease. And it's true in New Hampshire as well as it is in the rest of the country. You know, we like to think that New Hampshire sometimes is an exception, that we don't necessarily fall into national trends. And we do have, in general, lower incarceration rates than some other states in this country. But still, if you look between 1980 and 2016, you look at an increase of nearly ninefold of our incarcerated population, whether it be in our county jail facilities and in our prison facility. And I think that these statistics, right, are staggering. They really have an impact. They're really dramatic. But when you really think about the impact that incarceration has on the lives of individuals, on families, and on communities, it really is incredibly tragic. And it was really interesting over breakfast this morning. I have twin boys, they're 4 years old. I was feeding them oatmeal. And I was telling them a little bit about, I have to go this afternoon. I'm gonna talk, telling them what I was talking about. And they immediately asked me, they're like, well, what happens when mommies and daddies go to jail? Like, what happens to the kids? And do the kids get to see the mommies and daddies? Like, immediately, that's where they went. And you can really leave it up to a 4-year-old to go to the heart of the matter immediately. And so, the impact that these statistics, these ballooning incarcerations rates are having on our local communities as well as our country really impact, these are real humans that they're impacting, real families. And the issues don't just stop when an individual is released from incarceration, right? And it is 95% of all individuals who are incarcerated will at some point be released. They will be rejoining our communities. And in fact, as many Americans now have criminal records as have college diplomas. And so that's 1/3 of the adult working age population in this country has a criminal record. And once these individuals are released, they face just huge, enormous obstacles, some of which are actually ingrained in our laws that prevent them from really being able to fully integrate back into our communities and our society, whether it be obstacles to getting access to employment, being able to access housing, being able to access basic services that they need to be able to start reintegrating, to be able to provide for their families, and to be able to get reintegrated into their communities. And when you look at this now enormous population of people who are living in our country who are either behind bars or who have been forever stigmatized because of the impact of the criminal justice system, that population is overwhelmingly poor, and it is disproportionately black. Nationally, blacks are nearly 6 times more likely to be incarcerated by whites, and Hispanics are nearly twice as likely to be incarcerated as whites. 1 in 3 black men can expect to go to prison in their lifetime, where only 1 out of every 6, and 1 out of every 6 Latino man, and that's compared to 1 out of 17 white males. And black people are 10 times more likely to be incarcerated for drug offenses, even though we know that whites engage in drug offenses at the same rates as blacks. And I really love the fact that Jerry Ann began by sort of bringing us back to the work of Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow. How many of you have heard of this book or have read Oh, that's fantastic. That's great. So you really understand the narrative that she really builds that draws a direct line from slavery to Jim Crow era segregation and the violence of that era to the politics of the war on drugs and crime in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and that we still see going on today. And so it's very, very clear that these war on drug and crime policies are responsible for the enormous spike in the number of people, and particularly the number of people of color that are put behind bars today in our country. And I think it's particularly striking when you look at Alexander's writing, when you consider the fact that there are more black people under control of the prisons and corrections departments today than were ever enslaved in our country. And here in the Granite State, again, we're no exception. In New Hampshire, you're 6 times more likely to be incarcerated if you are black than if you are white. And we also have the history of some of the highest rates of Latino incarceration in the country. So these disparities do exist in the state of New Hampshire. As well as here in New Hampshire, we really see the crippling effects that having an experience in the criminal justice system, having a criminal record really has on individuals that have gone through that. In 2018, just last year, the ACLU of New Hampshire published a report, and we called it Lost Labor, the Collateral Consequences of a Criminal Record and Their Impact on New Hampshire's Workforce. And what this report really did was took a look at what the impact of the opioid crisis has been in New Hampshire and how it has really dramatically increased the number of individuals in our state that have a felony record because of is somewhat related to the opioid crisis. And so, more people are being arrested because of crimes that are associated with their drug abuse issues. And therefore, there are more people with a criminal record. And these people, once they have been through the criminal justice system, just face really extreme barriers in our state to housing, employment, and other basic services. It is very, very difficult for them to reintegrate, especially when it comes to employment. And what the report looks at this is really striking because, again, who has heard of the workforce shortage here in New Hampshire, right? This is like something that's potentially threatening our economy. It is a huge issue. You can't listen to Governor Sununu speak without hearing him talk about how he's going to address the workforce shortage issue here in New Hampshire. And yet we have this growing population of thousands of individuals in our state who have some criminal record that are finding it incredibly difficult to find employment. And some of these issues are statutory, some of them are regulatory, and some of them are due to employment discrimination. And the report also really includes the heartbreaking stories of what this looks like on the ground for particular individuals who have really paid their debt to society. They have, quote unquote, done their time, and they have made incredible efforts to try to reintegrate and are just finding it nearly impossible. And so we have this really serious issue. This issue is a national issue. This issue is an issue here in New Hampshire of mass incarceration and the aftermath of incarceration and the obstacles to reintegration. And so Professor Evans said that I had to be solutions-minded, right? So I'm going to be optimistic, and so I'm going to try to get there. But I will want to say before I go there that what is striking me more is that we have been talking optimistically about criminal justice reform in this country for almost a decade now. For my entire professional life, it has been, this is the window where we can see real reform. We have Republicans and Democrats who are on board on this issue. People understand that we can't afford to incarcerate this many individuals. And yet, our rates have not significantly dropped. And so I think the main message here is that reform is not happening fast enough. If we ever have a hope of getting back to the types of incarceration rates that we had in this country in the 1970s, we need to see radical change. We need to see it at a much, much, much faster pace. We need to see it also, it has to be at the federal and the state level, right? Because it's only a small fraction of our country's population that is in federal prisons. The majority of that population is in our state facilities. So we need state by state change in this area. And it isn't just one piece of the system either. We need to see reform in the police, in the courts, in the prisons. It needs to be at every step. And we are seeing some movement. How many people heard of the First Step Act that was passed at the end of last year? Wow, actually, that is amazing to me that like all of you had read Michelle Alexander's book and only 4 of you have heard of the First Step Act passing, which tells me a lot about where our media is in this country at this moment. And I it just wasn't covered, which is crazy. Congress finally does something and passes something that is actually progress. And it gets very, very little coverage, which I think is somewhat of a sad statement, but it is good to see at least some movement in this area at the federal level, but there needs to be much more done. We need much more powerful, deep movements like Black Lives Matter, like All of Us or None, the movements of prisoners that we're seeing throughout this country in recent years that have been striking. Really, if we're gonna have radical movement, if we're gonna move the dial, there needs to be deep social movements behind reform. We need to totally revamp our sentencing structure that are now really outrageously out of proportion with the rest of the world. And that really includes enacting comprehensive sentencing reform here in the Granite State, where increasingly long prison sentences are really contributing to the growth of our prison population. We need to take further initiatives like the bail reform that Senator Feltes was so instrumental in last year. We passed some really meaningful bail reform to make sure that people are not incarcerated before conviction just because they're too poor to pay for bail. But we need to go further. We need to take those reforms further. And we need to look at the role of prosecutors in our community. How many of you folks, when you go to vote and you see the county attorney line, do you really know who those folks are? Do you know what their positions are? Do you know how they approach their job? Do you even know what their impact is on your community? Because prosecutors have a tremendous amount of discretion, and the way they choose to use that discretion really has an impact on real people in their lives. And so we're trying to ask and get more information out there about who these people are and what their positions are on criminal justice reform. And we also need to see a real revolution within ourselves, within you and me and our institutions, and just the way that we as a society are thinking about the 70 million people who live in our country who have had an experience with the criminal justice system. This is especially true here in New Hampshire. We need to think hard about how we can make sure that the people in New Hampshire who have paid their debt to society have a fair shake at reintegrating. And this includes passing Senator Feltes' Fair Chance Hiring Bill this session. Some of you might know that as Ban the Box is how it's commonly referred to. And this is simply meant to enable people to have a fair shake at applying for and being considered for a job if they have a criminal record. And I also, of course, can't leave here today without saying here that in 2019, this is and this must be the year that here in New Hampshire we abolish the death penalty. Contact your reps. Contact your senators. Write to the governor. We know that too often death sentences aren't based on the heinousness of the crime. They are often based on the race of the defendant and or the victim, or on the quality of defense or on prosecutorial misconduct. And we are long overdue to repeal this archaic practice here in the state of New Hampshire. 2019 is the year for repeal. And so going forward, we really have to fundamentally shift the understanding of what mass incarceration has done to our society and the damage that it's wreaked on communities of color and the economically disadvantaged. And we simply need to fundamentally change the way that we approach individuals whose lives have been really irrevocably altered by these out-of-control criminal justice laws. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Senator Feltes.
Thank you, Devin.
Well, thank you very much, Devin, Tanya, Jerry Ann. We love you. Thank you for putting on this wonderful panel as we're set to commemorate and remember a king. There's no better issue, perhaps, in this day and age to talk about right now than criminal justice reform. It's an economic issue, and it disproportionately affects people of color and their families. So thank you for putting this on. A little bit about myself. Prior to serving in the state senate, I had the honor and privilege of serving as a legal aid lawyer for New Hampshire Legal Assistance for about a decade, protecting the legal rights of low-income granite staters, housing, protecting against foreclosure, fighting for entitled VA benefits for veterans, victims of domestic violence. And for 4 years, I had the honor and privilege of serving as the director of the Housing Justice Project, including managing our project and our grant at New Hampshire Legal Assistance to combat housing discrimination in the state. Part of that was an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice and looking at what we talk about, what Tanya talked about, the impact of poverty on communities of color. It's distinct in New Hampshire, and Devin talked about it. Whether you look at the census tract data overlaid by socioeconomic status and race, and you find that, for example, the Tree Streets in Nashua, certain census tracts in Manchester, Heights and Concord, disproportionate levels of poverty correlated to race right here in New Hampshire. You heard Devin talk about the statistics in terms of the impact here in New Hampshire. So this is an issue that a lot of us in this room have worked on and will continue to work on. And, we have a great opportunity, I think, this year. We worked hard to get a progressive Senate. And I got to say, I love all our new colleagues, but especially my now good friend, Melanie LeVake, the first African-American state senator in the state of New Hampshire right here. And she's got a lot of great pieces of legislation that are going to expand economic opportunity and voting rights and human rights for granite staters all across this great state, and she's doing a great job already. I look forward to working with her. Filter innocence simply because they're poor. That's done in New Hampshire. We got that done. And thank you to Devin and everybody in this room who worked on that. There's still more work to do. Still more work to do. We did annulment reform in that piece of legislation. There's another piece of annulment legislation coming forward this year that's really important. And it's really important that we do what Devin calls fair chance hiring, otherwise known by some as ban the box. I call it opportunity to compete. That's all we're looking for, is an opportunity to compete for jobs, that you're not getting your job application just thrown in the trash because you have a criminal record. That's not fair, and has a disparate impact on people who are poor and disparate impact on communities of color. And we need everybody to have an equal opportunity to compete for the jobs of today and tomorrow. So, hopefully, with your help, we're going to pass that piece of legislation and make sure that in New Hampshire, everybody has an opportunity to compete for a job, regardless of their background. So, we have a lot of work to do. There's many different kinds of legislation that we could talk about, but I'm going to leave it there. I think I'm well within my 10 minutes.
Well within, Senator, yes.
Okay, well, let me...
Unless you want to yield. Because you keep going.
Let me think of a few more... No, I'm just kidding. But what I want to close with is just this, is, President Obama was fond of saying, and it was first remarked upon in a Chief Justice opinion of the U.S. Supreme Court, the most important role in a democracy is that of citizen. That of citizen. Each and every day, citizen activists raising and elevating your voice, making a difference on the issues that you care about. And I gotta tell you, at the State House, it matters. It matters a whole heck of a lot. And I see a lot of people around the room have been engaged and have been fired up and have been raising their voices. It makes a big difference. There are a lot of people walking around the State House with these orange badges. They're registered lobbyists, often represent corporate interests. They have an opportunity to testify and provide input, and that's okay. But when people like the people in this room show up and speak out, it has a distinct and measurable, vastly greater impact on the legislative process than does someone with the orange badge in New Hampshire. The point being this, is that you all make an impact. We are all in this together. I firmly believe in that fundamental belief. We are all in this together, and that in order to move New Hampshire forward, we cannot leave anyone behind. That means everybody here. If you get fired up about this panel and this issue, get engaged. Get engaged on the legislation we've talked about. Working together, we can continue to make progress. We can continue to bend that moral arc of history the right way. And I look forward to working with all of you, and I look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you, New Hampshire School of Law, the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. It's an honor to sit here with these panelists here today. I'm just a police officer in the city of Nashua, and I'm honored to be part of this conversation, because these are conversations that need to be had by everybody, whether you're police, whether you're activists, whether you're government officials. We need to start talking about these things. So first of all, is there anybody here from Nashua? Awesome, great to see you. I just wanted to feel like somebody else from my team was here, so thank you. Needed some support. So my name is Carlos Camacho. I'm a lieutenant with the Nashua Police Department, and I've been with the department 17 years. I've worked my way up as a detective, patrolman, domestic violence unit. I used to work in professional standards, which deals with internal affairs and recruiting, very important stuff. And now I'm back on the street as a patrol lieutenant. I really enjoy being on the street, because for me, being out with the people that I serve, that's why I became a police officer. And I think most police officers will tell you, we became police officers to go be with the community and to talk to people and be with people. The reason I think I got selected to come up here and speak, it's because I'm in charge of a couple different good things that we're doing in Nashua. I'm also the chair of the Nashua Red Committee, which is the Racial Ethnic Disparities Committee. I'm also the chair of the State of New Hampshire DMC Committee. So you're probably saying, what are these committees about? The federal government, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, mandate every state to have DMC committees, disproportionate minority contact committees, to look at ways to keep minority youth out of the justice system. So every state has to have a state coordinator, and they have to have communities that are involved in this process to look at ways into how we can keep these kids out of the justice system. Because we know once somebody hits the justice system, the domino effect begins, and it's going to be harder for them to kind of get out of the justice system. So what can we do? And for myself, what can we do in Nashua to get these kids out of there? So there's several things that we have done in Nashua. We applied for grants through the OJJDP, and we were granted grants, and we sent these inner city kids from the tree streets to leadership camps, because poverty is the biggest, I think, in this country, the biggest fight we're gonna have to deal with. And I think we erase poverty, I think that's gonna help this whole country altogether. But all these kids that live in the inner city, I mean, they can't afford to go to summer camps like all the other kids in the community. So we got these grants, this funding, to send these kids to their first ever camp over the summer, through Boys and Girls Club, through Girls Inc. in Nashua, and several other organizations, PAL, Police Athletic League. And what we saw happen was these kids loved it so much that they were asked to come back the next year free of charge as leaders of these camps. And now they're becoming the spokespersons, the spokespeople, and getting put on these positions where they've never had an opportunity before. And that's what we're doing in Nashville. That's one of the things we're doing, excuse me. The other thing that we started doing in Nashua and through state DMC is try to talk to our police officers. And we started having these conversations, these training sessions, effective police interaction with youth, because we decided, you know what, not every crime, every time we go out with a juvenile, every time we go out with a kid, no matter what race they're from, we have a discretion, and we can either send that kid on his way, tell him, hey, that's not the right thing, get a break, or we can arrest him, give him a ticket, and that will get him in the justice system. And that's what we didn't want to do. So we decided that our officers need to learn that adolescents are not criminals, not doing the things that we're getting called to go deal with them with because they're criminals. They're doing it because they're kids. And then we went around the room to all our police officers and, we told them, hey, remember when you were a kid? Who gave you that break? Now you're the one that should be giving the break to the kid. So, and that kind of starting those classes, and we started teaching every police officer at the agency, and through state DMC, we started going into the police academy, because if you guys don't know, New Hampshire's very different with the way we train police officers. There's only one police academy in the whole state, and you're in there with troopers, you're in there with sheriffs, police officers, and it's here in Concord. And that's a very unique opportunity for new officers to start learning. So we started teaching them this class at the academy. As we're teaching these classes to our officers, they came up with the idea, well, you're teaching us how to deal with kids, how to give them a break. And obviously we're police officers, we have to do our job too. I mean, if a heinous crime or a serious crime occurs, we have to make an arrest. I mean, that's our job. But if we can give a kid a benefit of the doubt and cut them loose, give them a break, give them a break. They're being kids. And in that class, we talk about brain development, and we realize that the brain is developing till your early 20s. And then we looked at the room of police officers. Most of our police officers are in their early 20s. So now I'm thinking their brains haven't developed yet. But it was a great class, and it taught a lot of officers to treat kids a little bit, give them a break. And that was the whole purpose of this class. It's an 8-hour class. So during those classes, one of the officers raised his hand up and said, all right, you're teaching us how to deal with kids. Who's teaching the kids how to deal with police? So we're like, that's interesting. So the late Andrew Smith, he was a state DMC coordinator, good friend of mine, passed away last year. But he came up with this class, me, him, and other people at state DMC called the Mirror Project. And what we do with that class is we go to 8th grade classrooms and we talk to kids about respect and communication. We put them in a role-playing scenario. We make them be the police officers, and then we're the kids, the 2 officers that are teaching the class are kids, and we tell them, hey, you just got a call from a local business, and they just want these kids to get moved along because they're bothering the customers for whatever reason. Really no crime per se, other than trespassing if you want to go that route, but you just got to move the kids along. Move them along, you got 5 minutes. What we realized is that these kids, after those 5 minutes, said, wow, it's really tough to be a police officer. And, we gave them, parameters. You can't touch us. You can't, swear. You can't do anything like that. But we put them on the spot. And that started the whole conversation for that 1-hour class at these 8th grade classrooms about respect and communication. And we basically told them, don't be afraid to go meet your local police officers. We're human beings too. I have kids. I was a kid once. Come talk to us. The more you know about your local police officer, the more you feel comfortable talking to him, the better off you will be if somebody calls the police on you. Because if I know this kid is a good kid and I've dealt with him at the playground, I've dealt with his family, I know he's a good kid. If somebody calls that doesn't know him, I'm going to try to take care of this kid. So these classes started in Manchester and in Nashua. And what we're doing now, what Nashua Police is doing, from the back end of our administration, Chief Lavoie, the Deputy Chief Michael Crignan, and Deputy Chief Testaverde, is Nashua and Manchester are going out to other agencies throughout the state and teaching these other officers to bring this program to their local schools and local communities, because we at the state DMC level decided that it was very important to kind of get these kids to feel comfortable talking to police officers so they can get a benefit of the doubt and get to know these these officers if for some reason somebody calls the police on kids for doing things that kids do, which is just being kids. So we've done a lot of work there with that DMC initiative in Nashua and in the state. I'm also very proud to be working in Nashua because other efforts that we do in Nashua, we have the Nashua Community Conversation on Race and Justice, which is a forum to get people and the police to kind of sit down together and let's have a conversation. Let's have this difficult conversation on race and police and the shootings that are happening everywhere else in the country. Let's talk about it, because if we don't talk about these issues, nothing's ever going to get solved. You're going to hear things that maybe aren't true. We're going to hear things that maybe aren't true. But if we sit down together and talk about these things, it's going to be a whole better community overall. And we've had 2 of them at Riviera University. The next project we're hoping to do is it's still in the works. I'm going to break some news here to everybody because this hasn't been released yet. But we're trying to bring those to the 2 high schools in Nashua. Maybe get 30 kids with maybe 5 officers. 10 officers, and just kind of sit down and let's have a conversation. What do you want to talk about police about? Anything. About race, about how we do our job, about anything they want. So we're hoping to bring that to the schools to get these kids more comfortable to talking to police officers. Those are a few things. Plus, we're a big refugee community. Nashua has a lot of refugees that come into the city and become residents of the city. And we go to the Adult Learning Center where they're learning how to speak English and learning about American culture. And we teach a class on policing in America. Because most of these refugees and people from other countries that are coming here are very afraid of police departments because they were abused and bad things were happening to them because of their local police departments. So just going into that class and telling them, hey, call us, we're here for you, and shaking their hands, it blows their mind away. And we just want to get that conversation with them as well. We do have translators, because most of them are just learning how to speak English and stuff, but they are still part of our community. And we're trying everything we can to make them feel comfortable and feel welcomed. So those are some of the big things that I'm involved with in Nashua. A couple numbers, I know we're talking about disproportionate arrest. With DMC, we deal with minority individuals, obviously, and that's what the feds are looking at for the numbers. We've gone to national conferences. Andrew Smith, the state coordinator, several years ago, went to these national conferences because the country is looking at New Hampshire. Our numbers for incarcerations of black youth and Latino youth has gone down. It's still above the 1.1 versus the white youth, but they have come down significantly. And the rest of the country, at first, they said, New Hampshire, you're running your numbers wrong. You're doing it wrong because nobody's ever brought them down. So we hired a company to do our numbers and look at all our, arrest, juveniles referred to court, cases diverted, cases involving secure detention, cases petitioned, and so on and so forth. And they came out to say that New Hampshire, we are coming down. So they asked us what we were doing to get these numbers down. And we attributed this to the support from our bosses, so in the police department, the chiefs, and also these classes that we're teaching all the officers in the state is, give kids a break. If you can, give them a break. Because we were all kids once. We're not getting called to them because they're criminals. We're getting called to them because they're kids. And if they can have that positive contact with a child or an adolescent, that's going to go a long way for these kids in New Hampshire. And I think New Hampshire is on the forefront of this, because every time I go to these conferences in DC, they're always asking, how you guys doing this mirror project? Because this mirror project that we teach the 8th graders, strictly New Hampshire. And we've had requests to go to other states to teach the class. Obviously, I can't go there yet, but people want to know what we're doing in New Hampshire because we're on the map in the national stage, that our numbers are coming down. We're not perfect, and there's still a way to go, but I think New Hampshire is going towards the right direction. So, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'll let the moderator take over, and I'll be around, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant. So we have reached the point in the event to begin a Q&A. And I'm going to take moderator's license to ask the first, because I don't think I'll be able to double dutch my way back in if I don't do it now. Lieutenant Camacho, as you were settling in, one thing popped into my mind as you were speaking, and you were specifically focused on 8th grade. And I have to believe that there's a method to the madness. I'm wondering if you could share that with us.
Yeah, so when we first came up with this program, the Mirror Project, we said, well, what kids can we start with teaching this class, or what kids can we start the class with? So we figured 8th grade, because most of the kids are about to go into high school, and that's where they're going to be around more opportunities to get in trouble. Obviously in Nashville, the high schools are a little bit bigger, and there's a big amount of things that they can be tempted with. So we're hoping that respect and that those communications or those talks start earlier in 8th grade to kind of prevent them from getting into trouble in their high school years, which is where we see a lot of kids start to get into real serious trouble. Just to add, the state DMC committee has realized that, you know what, we need to go younger. So we're currently working under the state advisory group to come up with we called it grammar school, but then the educators in the group just said that grammar is kind of like an old-fashioned word. You can't use that anymore. I'm not a educator, but yeah, they said elementary school level kids. So we're going to try to do a program for the 5th and 6th graders to kind of simulate the Mirror Project, talk about respect and communication. So that's in the future, hopefully sooner than later.
And if I can see your hands, if you know that you have a question right now, so I can move across the room. Yes.
Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this. I think it's very imperative. I have a young son, who's a 8-year-old. I know that there's a method to the madness, as you emphasized, but the prison to pipeline methodology, how is New Hampshire addressing this? I'm going to save my 3 questions just in case I don't get back to it. But that's question 1. Lieutenant, you mentioned looking at younger than that, ages for that. Secondly, you mentioned in the presentation also that people who are in prison, they don't get the right to vote. So is there an effort to expunge their, they've had their prison time, but is there an effort to expunge that so that they can influence the voting process? And since there's such a high population of people of color in prison, that's a very serious problem. And the third one is, how do we, is there any group, I know that I've been to groups like this and discussions, and it's always emphasized on the south of the state. There's a lot of issues in North Country where I live, and it never goes past Nashua or your Concord. So what efforts are being done? And if there isn't, I'm willing to work in this process to spread it, because you have Lebanon, you have Berlin, you have Plymouth. And the other thing, you also, and this is my 4th question, okay, Jerry?
One's a merit, keep going.
So my 4th question is, you talk about people, the children, what about the adults? You talk about immigrants. I'm not an immigrant, I'm an indigenous American here, and there has been a coexistence of racial profiling from the vagrant laws to Jim Crow. Is there any efforts being done to that, to expunge those? Because they specifically target in slavery, and police historically were enforced to manage the slaves. So is there any effort in that capacity? And if so, if not, I'll be more than willing to start that. Thank you.
So let me do this to try and distill some of those, because there's a confluence of issues there where you can perhaps drill down a little bit. The first mentioned pipelines to prison. The second, an important one, is clearly the right to vote. The issues between, I'm from Philadelphia. I'm learning. I've been here a year and a half, so the point is well made, evidently. There were a lot of head nods as you mentioned this distinction between South and North in New Hampshire. And then this idea of the focus on children is important, but it can't be an either or, but a both and. So speak to any of those that you care to.
Sure. So we were just trying to divide them up because they're all such fantastic questions, and I was like, I want them all because they're so. You have touched on so many really distinct and really critical, important points. And I think will generate really good discussion. So very, very quickly, absolutely, I personally, in the work that we have done with regards to schools and with regards to arrests and incarceration of youth, we do believe that there is a prison to pipeline issue in the state of New Hampshire. We're actually about to release a report jointly with New Hampshire Legal Assistance, where Senator Feltus used to work, that's going to be talking about the disproportionate, especially consequences for students, in particular students of color, and in particular students with disabilities when it comes to exclusionary discipline in New Hampshire schools. So when it comes to suspensions, when it comes to expulsions, when it comes to these types of punishments in the school. And we'll be releasing that shortly. And we have some legislation that has been proposed to make it more difficult for schools to just simply suspend and to exclude. And what we're seeing in New Hampshire schools is they tend to not expel students. What they will do is they will suspend them again and again and again and again so that they never have to register that individual as actually being expelled. And to talk to a parent who is experiencing that it's incredibly frustrating. So I definitely think that this is an issue that we need to look at closely. I know that recently the Sununu Center, which is the one youth detention facility in New Hampshire, recently we were hearing that it was up to 40% of the young people that were kept there were kids of color. And so I definitely think that this is an important issue. On the right to vote, very quickly, this is absolutely an issue we should be looking at here in New Hampshire. We are lucky, and people should know this, that in New Hampshire you can vote if you have a felony record. A huge problem in New Hampshire is that people do not understand that individuals who go through our system don't know that after they leave they have a right to vote, because in so many states throughout our country you don't. And so we're trying to advance reforms that will require our corrections system to let people know that when they are released they do have the right to vote and to civically engage. And there is also a bill this year, and we think it's a fantastic idea to allow individuals who are currently incarcerated to be able to vote. And we see that, I believe, in both Vermont and Maine. They have that right. And I have talked to superintendents who think, and the head of our own New Hampshire Department of Corrections think that this is a fabulous idea, because what they know is that when individuals become civically engaged and they feel more connected to their community and they have an ability to affect their community, they're more likely to successfully reintegrate.
Thank you, Devin. As Devin mentioned, there is a piece of legislation addressing the school to prison pipeline issue. That's being submitted by Senator Martha Hennessy, the chair of Senate Judiciary, another wonderful member of the new majority. And by the way, I have the honor of being the majority leader of this new progressive majority in the state Senate. And really important piece of legislation. Again, working together on this, I think we can make a very real impact. Devin, I think, covered the waterfront and the voting issue. But what I would say to... Oh, okay.
I'm here.
Oh, there I have a 4-month-old and an 18-month-old at home, so I feel ya. They're not here though. But in any event, what we could do, especially with respect to the North Country and the lack of access to different services in the North Country, it's across the board, really. We're talking about economic opportunity to civil rights to other opportunities. We have had some annulment reform, as we talked about. Senator Hennessy is going to have another annulment reform bill to really clean up our annulment system. And the NAACP has partnered with lawyers and volunteers and community activists in Manchester to do annulment clinics. As far as I'm aware, there's no annulment clinics in the North Country, and there's no help with that. Especially with improvements in our law, based on last year's law and hopefully this year's legal changes, it really opens up the opportunity for people that have served their debt to society to clean up that record, have the opportunity to do that. To do some of these clinics in the North Country, I think would be a great idea, especially with the law changes. And I think that's something that different folks can work with you on and try to do. Last thing, in terms of working on folks' records, I had a bill last year that got voted down, and I think we'll probably work on it in the budget this year, and hopefully we'll get it through. But using TANF, Temporary Assistance Needy Family Reserve Dollars, TANF Reserve Dollars, for TANF eligible persons leaving prison, to have them get the annulment assistance to clean up the records upon reentry so that they have the economic opportunity, they get on their feet, they move forward. It's a cost-effective and legitimate investment of TANF reserve dollars, and we have a significant TANF reserve in the state of New Hampshire. And hopefully we can put that in this year's budget and move forward on that. So,
Well, thank you. What I just want to say about statewide training, I'm the chair of the state DMC, like I mentioned earlier, and one of our efforts is to promote disproportionate minority contact training throughout the state. We've taught officers in Moulton Borough, out in Portsmouth, Londonderry, obviously that's south, but we're trying to get more word out to the northern country, because my team goes up and they have to get trained by us to be certified in teaching the Merit Project to the 8th grade classes in their communities. Word's getting out because these chiefs of police, we need the backing from the chiefs of police, obviously it's their departments. And the juvenile justice specialist at the Sununu Center, she's the one that goes out and talks to these chiefs to look, to get the 4 core requirements mandated by the federal government, and then she talks about DMC issues and lets them know about the Merit Project to kind of get the word out. And then she gives them my information because they want to hear it from a police officer if, the chief's like, oh, I want to know more. So they'll call me and I'll tell them, and I'll send my team up to wherever their agencies are to train them to kind of get that going. But that's on the minority side. On the adult side, what I would recommend doing, the national community conversation on race and justice, that got started because there was a lot of talk in the community about the police were stopping people of color more often than white people, and there was complaints and all sorts of other issues going on. So we said, why don't we all sit down together and let's have a conversation. And this was going to be a couple meetings and try to solve these issues. Well, we realized that this wasn't going to get solved with just a couple meetings. So we meet every other month at the police department, and it's groups from the NAACP, the Office of Black Unity, which is a group in Nashua, and we all come together. And what we've been doing this for 3 years. We all became really good friends. They call us all the time for issues, questions, and what we came up with is that a lot of the stuff is all rumors. There were some issues that we took care of in the very beginning, but now everything's running smoothly, and I think I can say from knowing these people that we work with in the community, they're helping us to help the community, and we're helping them in the community as well. I go to their barbecues in the summertime, which is great food. We're going to the Martin Luther King breakfast tomorrow, which is it's a great event every year. But I think the first thing you have to do in the northern country or in your communities is get a hold of your police chiefs or your police department and call them up and say, hey, we need to sit down and have these conversations. It's going to be tough for them to say, yeah, let's do this, but we need to have these conversations. And feel free to let them know, hey, talk to Nashua Police, the Chief Lavoie. He's on board with this program. He's one of the ones that started this program. But you need to get the backing from your police departments to just sit down with a conversation. Maybe it's just over coffee, the first one, and to get a program together and talk about these issues, because we need to sit down together. And the sooner you can sit down with your police department, it takes time. We've been at it for 3 years, but it does work.
And I just want to note, I wanted to recognize, I've been part of these discussions that Nashua has having, and I've also been in touch with departments that do a lot of PR work. And this is not PR work, what Nashua is doing. It is very deep, very difficult conversations, very well moderated, really engaging in these community activists, ongoing work that I think is really transformational for the city of Nashua. So I think using Nashua as a model makes a lot of sense.
And we'll be more than happy to talk to any agency, any person you would like for us to let them know what we're doing to help you guys out as well.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I'm a retired teacher, so I've been kind of aware of the issues of discipline and work within the schools. And I just sort of a nuts and bolts question. I saw recently a report about how in some states there are the resource officers actually they make reports to their departments, and they mentioned that these are the kind of things that they're talking about are confidential, that we as school employees are not allowed to talk about. We're not allowed to spread that information, that those kind of records, that if there are any records like that in the school, are destroyed. So I was just wondering kind of nuts and bolts, what happens here? Do resource officers make these kind of reports to their departments?
So I'm happy to talk a little bit more generally, and then I would be really interested in hearing what happens in Nashua. Because I think I can pretty safely say that it really just depends on the town. And I can say that because a while back, we were trying to get a sense. We knew that that there were more and more New Hampshire schools from all over, not just in city centers, all over that were getting these resource officers. And we were trying to figure out, well, how are they being used and what are they being used for? And what are the agreements between the police departments and the school systems for what their roles are to make sure that they're playing an appropriate role? And of course there must be some kind of agreement, because if you look at the National School Resource Association of the United States, they say very clearly that you should have an agreement. And so we actually did a right to know request to see what these agreements look like in Nashua, in Manchester, in a bunch of different towns and cities. And what we were really shocked by is that the vast majority of towns that have school resources had absolutely no written agreement with their local police department. And so what you have seen is that the relationships and the roles that these resource officers are playing in these various communities completely differ. Sometimes they play an education role. They're teaching some stuff about substance abuse. Sometimes they're used almost as a disciplinary force. Some of them are there full time. Some of them are there part time. And so it really varies, I think, community to community greatly what the roles of these resource officers are. And so what we did is we passed a law that said that if you're going to have a school resource officer in your community, you need to have a written agreement that clearly lays out, for the sake of the department, for the sake of the officer, for the sake of the community and the parents, that they can know what the role of this officer in their school, in their schools is. And hopefully that they would know things like, well, what information is going back to the department? What is the role of this officer? How does the authority of the officer interact with the authority of, say, a principal? So that you don't have somebody like we have seen in New Hampshire, where some poor kid does a joke and orders a pizza delivery to the school and then winds up being arrested instead of having some kind of disciplinary action. And so I think it really, really depends on the community.
Yeah, I mean, we have school resource officers at our two high schools, one in each high school. And what I've seen, I've never worked in our juvenile division, even though I do a lot of minority work in the community. I was never a juvenile detective, but what I've seen them do, because I do go visit them on occasion, is they're more like counselors out there. We don't get a lot of reports from them. They might do missing children reports, where somebody reports a missing child at night, and they know that kid's a student at that school. They might kind of follow up with that. If a crime does occur where they get involved, they will take action. But from what I've seen, is they're more like guidance counselors. Kids go into their office, have lunches with them. A lot of kids that are looking into law enforcement as a career path are a lot of the kids that go in there as well. But they mentor these kids. They talk to these kids. And what I've seen is my mirror project instructors, I try to make them school resource officers first, because they're the ones that know how to talk to kids. I don't want to have that, that officer that's on the street, the SWAT officer that's, hard charging all the time. You need a special kind of officer to get in front of 8th grade kids and juvenile kids and tell them, hey, look, we're here to help you guys out. So your school resource officers, they're probably one of the best officers out there to talk to kids and get the program across. So,
Devin, what is the First Step Act, And Dan, in an attempt to address the fair chance opportunities, is the BIA on board with that? Will they be strong advocates on the business side in fighting for that in the legislature?
What Zib's talking about is the Business and Industry Affairs, which is association. Sorry, Business and Industry Association, which is a statewide chamber of commerce for New Hampshire. Are they going to be in support? We had a good discussion with them. I don't think they've taken an affirmative position yet. Devin's colleague at ACLU, Gene Huruska, Professor Schur from this law school have teamed up, and they're working on it too. And they did a great presentation to the BIA Human Resources Committee. But at this point, I don't think they've taken a firm position one way or another. I think that there's been a lot of good work by Gene, by Professor Schur, and others. A lot of groundwork laid on this piece of legislation around the state with business groups and business leaders. And there may be a tweak or two along the way, but in the legislation. But I'm pretty confident that working together we'll be able to get it done.
And so, yeah, and we have, I know Jeannie has been meeting with all sorts of different industry, not just the BIA,
Yep.
but, the hotel associations, the automobile dealerships, all of these different associations to really try to help them make the connection. And quite frankly, it's why we framed the report the way we framed it. It's like, you need workers. There are workers out there. You need to give them a chance, and we all need to give them a chance, and this is a way to address the issue. So I think from our expectations are not that they're going to be clamoring to support the legislation, but we have gotten a number of associations to agree not to oppose it. I wish that I could give you a detailed description of what the First Step Act did, but I just am not following federal legislation that closely. I know that what it does is it's a first step at making certain sentencing reforms, and I wish I had more knowledge to get into the detail of that, but I just don't. But we can follow up later.
And the biggest issue with it is active.
Right, it's not right. So
People who were sentenced in the 80s
Absolutely.
and 90s under the crack
Absolutely.
sentencing are still getting those life sentences.
And
the next step is to take the First
First
Step
Step,
Act
right.
and have it look backwards, and that's why we saw clemency.
You're absolutely right. What she was saying was that one of the issues with the First Step Act, and one of the reasons why the ACLU actually didn't, at different points as it took different iterations, was pulling back and wasn't sure if we were going to support it, is because it's not retroactive, which means that we've had these laws and these people who have been incarcerated for many years because of these really harsh sentencing. If you've already been convicted, this law is not going to help you. And so that is one of the issues. And so what she was saying is the next step is, how do we make it retroactive? And we've seen this tension with other reforms when there was attempts to address the crack powder cocaine disparities, trying to bring those closer together and get rid of those disparities where there was a resistance to having it retroactive, and that's problematic if you really want to reduce the population.
Thank you.
My question is timely. And it has to do with the testifying that New Hampshire police officers do at the State House. For instance, I remember last year with the death penalty bill, there were quite a few police officers that came in and they did not want the death penalty repealed. So that, and then just last week was the sex trafficking bill, where there were several police officers there wanting the sentence to be increased for people that have been doing the sex trafficking of children. Yet the people that were there to stick up for the children that have been trafficked said that bill is not good for them. So those two things there, and there are, of course, other bills that the police do testify on, and my feeling is they're not usually testifying in support of the things that we're talking about here today. So who decides who's going to testify at the State House representing the police of New Hampshire?
I've never been to the State House. This is the
fine.
North Country for me. Yeah, I don't go past Manchester usually, but I know the New Hampshire Police Police Association, NHPA. I think they're the ones that they have people that go up to the State House on a regular basis. And I don't know if they have lobbyists. I don't know if they, I think they have lobbyists or police officers. They ask for police officers sometimes to go up there and on whatever bills, they'll send out an email to all the members and say, hey, these are the bills coming up. If you're available, come up if you want. It's all volunteer stuff, so I think that's who sends the officers up there.
And so I used to do all of our, before Jeannie was on our team, our new political director, I used to be at the State House a lot. And I actually worked a lot with the different police chiefs. There are different, just to be clear, there are different law enforcement agencies in New Hampshire, and they are represented differently at the State House. So you have your police chiefs, which are represented by the Police Chiefs Association.
Yep.
They do have a paid lobbyist, and they do have generally one chief that is, in any given time, really tagged with being the lead on legislative, but then they do bring in other chiefs when there are many hearings and depending on their interests. And then of course there are the line officers who are represented by a different agency that also have their own paid lobbyist that is a different firm. And then you have the state police, which has its own representation from the state agency that can vary. I would say, I've heard a lot of people be upset about seeing officers in uniform testifying. I don't necessarily personally feel that way. I do think that law enforcement has a role to play in informing our laws. Their experience, we don't want to completely ignore that experience when we're crafting laws. We've actually worked with the Chiefs of Police Association. They were very strong supporters, especially Chief Calaruso from Dover came out and testified very passionately in favor of the bill to add gender identity to our non-discrimination laws. The Chiefs of Police were incredibly supportive of that bill. I worked very closely with the Chiefs of Police on a bill around body cameras, where we actually had like 3 hours of negotiation over that bill, but we actually came to a place where my office thinks that bill, my national office thinks that bill is the best bill in the entire country addressing body cameras and how they should be regulated. And I think that was because it was a very thorough negotiation process. So I do think that there is a role. What I get concerned about is what I don't see is any organized voice or very few folks that represent the organized voice of people who are affected by the system. People who have actually been through the criminal justice system. You don't hear what happens to their families. You don't see their faces generally, and certainly not in a very organized way. And so what we're trying to do in when we think about our work and how we do this work is to try to think about how can we work more closely with people who have actually been affected by the criminal justice system and put them more at the center of the work that we're doing and in a more directive position in the work that we're doing around these issues. So.
Thank you. That's a great question, and there's what I heard in it was also just the next leap is if there are police or officers who are on the ground in one sense connecting with community, but when you show up to the State House or when you show up to courtrooms and they're on the other side, then it is an important point to consider when we talk about community building and the impact that has. So again, not an either or, but both and sometimes they are going to be on the quote unquote other side. So what types of conversations need to happen on the front end to deal with it perhaps at a legislative level. But again, a great question without a complete answer, but at least a really great dialogue, sir.
Thanks, Tanya. I just put a pin on what Devin said, which is that, anybody and everybody should be able to be there and raise their voice. And what Devin said is there isn't the kind of, at least right now, voices of people who have been adversely affected. Even during the bail reform debate, which, even a few days in jail pending your trial, you can lose your job, you can lose your housing. Depending on your situation, you might even lose your kids. Being an advocate at Legal Aid before serving in the state Senate, one of the things when we were occasionally up at the State House, people said, what do you have specific examples? And it's difficult because it's tough to get this far north, right?
It is. Gotta waste it.
Probably even, especially tomorrow, it's going to be
Yeah.
really tough. But it's tough for people who are, oftentimes feel disempowered and are low income and feel down and out and are juggling childcare and all kinds of things going on in their lives to show up and have their voice heard. So it's incumbent upon, as I said earlier, there's people with orange badges walking around, but you can make a big difference. You can raise your voice. You can help do the community building that Tanya just talked about. Our friend from the North Country can work in whatever community you're in to help work with your organizations on the ground to get people's voices heard. And at the end of the day, we are all in this together, so everybody's voice does matter, whether we agree or disagree. It's just that, as Devin said, it's important to have a complete picture where everybody's voice is heard. And I think that's something we can all do a better job of, is really working together to get everybody's voice elevated during the process.
We had a couple of questions on this side as well. You had the mic already, and then we'll come to you.
We haven't talked about
Hot mic. Hot mic.
very hot. The role of substance use and mental health in being a pipeline, as well as some of the kids that are involved with SROs. Can you talk about the existence of or the planning for mental health and/or drug courts in this state? Hopefully, they're already in Manchester and Nashua, but I worry about the east and the west and the north. I kind of draw a triangle from Nashua up to Concord, back down to Salem, and that's one state. And then the rest of the world is a different state. So do those courts exist? Are they being used? And what are people's thoughts about more of them going forward?
I can start off. So Nashville, we do have a drug court for people that get are involved in, obviously drug use. And the lieutenant in charge of that court has told me that there are some successful stories out of that, and people do go to the court, and because they have to do certain things by the judge, and everybody's presenting, and we help them out, and there are some successful stories that come out of the drug court, which is a good thing to see. Obviously, not everybody is a success, but the ones that we are helping out there and are turning their lives around I think that's a good thing. But the drug court does work. Nashua, we have a very big mental health community, just because community council is in Nashua. It's the greater Nashua area community council, so everybody comes to Nashua for mental health treatment. We do have a mobile crisis line that's run through I believe it's through the hospitals, where people can call 24 hours a day if they don't want to talk to a police officer. And then our 2 hospitals in Nashua have access teams availability in case somebody needs to talk to them. So I think in Nashua we do have some resources, and I could see how it could be difficult outside that triangle because there's not enough resources throughout the whole state. But I think in Nashua, that I've seen, I think we are making some progress. We still need a lot of work, but it is working.
We do have drug courts. We worked in a bipartisan way to appropriate money for them. I think the challenge with it, as the lieutenant just said, is that if you really want them to work, you have to have the resources there, the backup resources, including housing, affordable housing, case management services, drug treatment services, and we're second to last in the country in drug treatment capacity, behind Texas. And we have the second worst opioid epidemic in the country still. And so it's an ongoing problem, and we're gonna do our level best to provide treatment and recovery capacity and build it out. There's a lot of talk about this hub and spoke thing you might have read about in the newspaper. That's a 2-year grant.
Right.
That's it.
It's a demonstration grant.
Yes, 2 years. And we need to do something to help with the workforce, which is why we do have legislation on behavioral health rates. Actually, that's going to be heard at 2 p.m. in Senate Finance, State House Room 103. Senator Rosenwald's bill to bolster our behavioral health rates in Medicaid expansion, something that wasn't achieved in our bipartisan compromise yet. We need to bolster those rates because that's the biggest thing towards capacity building. We also have legislation up for hearing this Tuesday at 1 p.m. in Senate Health and Human Services, room 101 of the Legislative Office Building, to help address the emergency room boarding crisis, mental health crisis. As many of you know, there are people, many cases, laying in cots in hallways of emergency rooms across the state of New Hampshire, just waiting to be referred to appropriate mental health treatment. That's happening right now in the state of New Hampshire. 30 to 40 people a day, and sometimes several kids. So we have legislation to deal with that. That is Senate Bill 11, and that's at 1 p.m. this Tuesday, Senate Health and Human Services, room 101 of the LOB. More generally, mental health courts. There are some pilots, but there's a committee. I think Senator Morgan has a bill in to look at the, building them out. It hasn't had as much experience as drug courts. Regardless of the situation, you need the resources there to make any of these truly effective. And another piece of legislation, everybody, if you're interested in this, should put on your radar screen, is the 10-year mental health plan is up for debate and discussion. So what we have going on Tuesday is a temporary fix for the emergency room boarding crisis, but more globally, the issue of mental health and how it cross-cuts all these issues is going to be the topic of debate and discussion, and hopefully your input in the 10-year mental health plan, long-term planning, the resources to kind of finally deal with this in the state of New Hampshire.
And I would just quickly add that to echo what Dan has said, all of which I agree with, and that it's part of why the ACLU actually has sued the state, and the hospitals have now intervened for the fact that these individuals are being detained, in many cases without really any significant treatment in emergency rooms. I would also say, with regards to the resources, it's not only are resources necessary to make, say, drug courts or mental health courts effective, which no doubt that's the case, but I would also say what we should really be looking at is how can we divert and find alternatives to having these individuals in the criminal justice system at all. And that also, when it comes to mental health and when it comes to substance use disorders, takes resources.
The other thing that I just thought about in Nashua and Manchester is the Safe Stations program. And that's through every fire department in the city, and people can just walk up there if they have any drug issues, and they try to get them the resources that they need. So, and they don't call law enforcement at all for those, and that's been very successful in Nashua and Manchester.
My first question is to the lieutenant, then my second question is to you too. You said that your statistics are going down as far as helping kids. Now, my question to you, what is the level of African Americans, American Indians, and Hispanics in your state versus the country? Now, let's be realistic. You don't have that many
Correct.
minorities up here.
Correct.
All right, so therefore the statistics may be easier for you, but what's happening nationally where the majority of the people are minorities? And my second question is about cops, period. All right, what is the state doing, state-wise and nationally, to do something with these cops who are shooting and killing blacks like it's for target practice? What is their penalties? Are they locking all these people up? Because we hear them getting away with this stuff. And are cops being forced to be psychologically tested at least 2 or 3 times a year to maintain their jobs?
Good. So the first question, yeah, I mean, obviously New Hampshire, we are, especially in the southern end of the state, very diverse, but compared to the rest of the country, we're very white. The numbers that we give to the federal government on DMC issues that have gone down, we look at our white population and then the minority population, whether it's African American, Latino, Asian, Native, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, American Indian, or other mixed. One of the biggest races that I've seen that we at one of the conferences is the mixed race, because we let people self-identify when they come in, and when somebody comes into our booking area, I mean, we let them self-identify. Our officers don't pick and choose. Hey, if you want to say you're purple today, you're purple. We'll put down purple. But the mixed race is one of the biggest ethnicities that we're seeing around. So what we do is we'll look at the white population in New Hampshire with that minority population, and then there's a math problem, and they take all these numbers, and that's where we're coming down. We're not equal. We're still above the 1-for-1 ratio, but we have brought it down a little bit, and that's what the feds were saying. What are you guys doing in New Hampshire? Because we've never seen that before. Because all over the country, the numbers are going up because the minority population is getting larger, and that's one of the main reasons that DMC changed from disproportionate minority contact to racial and ethnic disparities. Because in some states, the minorities are becoming the majority. And now you look at women as well, they're becoming the majority. So it's not really disproportionate minority contact, it's racial and ethnic disparities. The second question, I mean, that's a tough situation no matter how you look at it, and anywhere you go. I mean, I don't think any officer wants to go out there and say, hey, I shot somebody today, whether they're black, white, Hispanic. You're seeing now a lot of officers are getting sentenced. I think just the other day in Chicago, an officer got sentenced for a shooting. And yeah, I mean, I think that's you look at the video, you're like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, but see, that's not any time either. You know what I'm saying?
Right,
I mean,
right.
if I shot you, you're going to give me life if you don't lynch me. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I will not be dead.
No, all kidding aside,
Yeah.
though, it should be equal.
No, and I agree. And we
that's
see
not fair.
we see these videos, in our cafeteria, while we're eating dinner with my other officers, and you see these videos in the nightly news, and you're going, oh my gosh, that's horrible. And then you just kind of see what happens and let them do their investigation. Obviously, there's always two sides to every story. And news, you got to remember, news wants to play they'll only show you a clip of something. We need to see the whole picture. And working in internal affairs, as I did for several years, that was my job, is to find out the whole picture. And I'm not the one in internal affairs that decides if he's guilty or not. I just provide the facts to my boss, the chief, and then the chief's the one that decides. And then if it's something criminal, then the Attorney General's office gets involved. But we're very fortunate. Nashville's a nationally accredited police department, and we take everything very seriously, and our training is top notch. And I think it goes down to training. We have diversity training every year, and we're teaching our officers, because they will see the diversity in Nashville. A lot of these officers from New Hampshire, from Massachusetts, or from wherever they're from, Texas, they're going to see the diversity in Nashville. And we know that, one, we got to train them properly, and two, they're going to be responsible for their actions. I mean, you're going to get all the training you have, but you mess up, we're not going to cover for you.
If you remember the film clip where they showed the black guy, I think it was North Carolina or South Carolina, he had both his hands up, but the cop still shot him and killed him.
Yeah, I mean, there are some cases that are, you see the officer and you're like going, man, he's got something coming to him through the court system. But I mean, it's also everything happens in a split second, and I don't want to be second guessing an officer out there or a person out there that does a shooting. I mean, we have a lot of shootings that people don't get arrested for as well, like non-police shootings, just because of certain laws or what happened, the whole situation. But yeah, you're right. There's some officers out there that, there's bad people in every profession. And, my job is as a police officer, I think I live in a glass house, because whatever one officer does something bad, we're all doing it bad. And, hey, I knew that going into this job, but it's my job now to educate my young officers and tell them, hey, look, let's do some training, let's do diversity training. That's why I enjoy doing what I do. And that's why I like being out on the street with these young officers and teach them more community bias, community policing actions. We all swore and took an oath to protect the community, and we all, every kid that came into our interview room that wants to be a police officer, first thing they always say is, I want to help people. So why has that changed, 10, 12 years down the road? Because, and that's what our job as supervisors is, keep that fire of helping people, lit in these young officers. And I take pride in that. My chief does, and my administration does. And I think that's why we do all these great community events. That's why I'm here today. I mean, obviously I had asked permission to come up here and talk. And they said, yeah, go do it. take care of business. Because we're proud of what we do in Nashua. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think we're going in the right direction.
We're going to take this question, and the final question will be there. We'll do a little bit more rapid fire in the interest of time. And a final point about your question, which was well made, is that I've often heard in the community that it's one thing, again, to community build, but we really do want to see unions coming up against bad cops. And that would be the biggest signal and sign that it's talking the talk and walking the walk. There are departments who are working in that way. And I hope over time we will continue to see that. The unions, they have their role to play, but a major signal, it seems, would be when you start seeing unions coming against bad cops to say, we don't want you here, you're making it more difficult. Your job is already insanely difficult as it is, and the perception sometimes is the reality. So, great question. Yes, ma'am.
This is a little off target, but there is this wait time. People are in emergency rooms when they need mental health.
Right.
Why is New Hampshire Hospital so small? I think it was very poor planning to plan with so few rooms available to people. Something like 146 for the whole state. Doesn't make sense.
Right. Well, the question was why is New Hampshire Hospital so small? And it's accurately noting that there is, in the system of moving people to adequate and appropriate mental health care, if you're in severe emotional distress and determined to be a danger to yourself or others, you could potentially be placed in New Hampshire Hospital. Some states have gone to a model where they don't even have that kind of institutionalization of people with severe emotional distress. And in fact, a lot of people would argue, and a lot of the experts would argue, that that's the ideal. So the question about the capacity at the hospital, I wasn't around when they decided how. You were, but I don't know what the debate was about the number of rooms. There'll be a continued debate. There'll be a continued debate about the number of rooms. I think the bigger debate, and this is a debate that's going to happen Tuesday afternoon too, is how do we make sure people, regardless of their level of severe emotional distress, with mental illness, why don't we treat that as another healthcare issue? Because that's what it is. And part of the bill says that health insurance carriers need to actually compensate hospitals for the treatment of people in that situation on parity with standard medical surgical. Why? Because it's a healthcare crisis. And some health insurance carriers you might see on Tuesday are not going to like that. But as Devin said, if you're in that situation, sometimes the hospitals aren't potentially providing the kind of services while people are waiting to get transferred to the necessary and appropriate facility, in part because they're not getting paid by health insurance carriers and providers. And so, look, there's a whole bunch of stuff to this. And part of that bill is transitional housing for people leaving mental health care facilities.
They reduced it tremendously.
I'm sorry, did you reduce what?
In 1978, they closed LaCourney State School.
Right.
And
Yep.
they emptied out New Hampshire Hospital. And they were supposed to have residential facilities all over the state.
Right.
But they closed them.
Yeah, so.
That's where part of the problem is.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
But I mean, New Hampshire used to have the model, right?
Well, New Hampshire used to have what was considered to be, by a lot of folks, to be a model or one of the top models. And we certainly didn't have the situation we have now. And this has been in the works for 10 or 15 years, not to inject some degree of politics here, but I guess you invited a politician, I guess. But the O'Brien budget in 2010 really cut a lot of these services, and a lot of mental health services, and quite frankly, a lot of child protection services. So we're building this infrastructure back up in a cost-effective way. We have a child protection crisis, a childhood mental health crisis as well. I have a piece of legislation to to create a comprehensive system of care for children finally in the state of New Hampshire, so we get upstream and take care of our kids. And so these are things that we're going to be hotly debated, and they should be in this legislative session, and they have impacts on the flow of where people go. They have impacts on how long people are in different locations. But at the end of the day, we all got to work on this. We'll do it. Let's do it.
All right. Final question.
I got this directed to the lieutenant. I lived in, actually I worked in Nashville in the mid-60s, where the minority population was anybody who wasn't French. And it was also, if you didn't work for Sanders, you were a minority. Yeah. And I'd like to compliment you on your school program, because I think a lot of our problems is not understanding the other race. And I see all this stuff on TV because they don't understand the people that they're defending or fighting against. If I know you're a regular guy, like I'm a regular guy, then I have more respect for you. Right. I live in a town where I'm 50% of the minority population. My only problem is I get overprotected. I was going out my driveway with my snowblower, and I left the snowblower at the bottom of the driveway to go up to check my house. When I come back, the police car is there to check to see if I'm okay. So to see the snowblower running and there's nobody there. So I'm overprotected. But I want to compliment you again on your trying to understand each other. Understanding is 100% of our problems.
Right, well, thank you very much.
I just want to mention a couple things that this brought up. The over-surveillance of certain populations who end up in going through our prison system, and also the role that implicit bias plays on who gets incarcerated and who gets over-surveilled. And I think there are two cases in New Hampshire that really pointed to this. First of all, the one person that we have on death row in New Hampshire, why we haven't rallied against getting rid of the death penalty for the one person that we have on death row, and the man in Manchester who died because of a $10,000 bail.
Yeah, Jeffrey Pendleton.
Jeffrey Pendleton.
Yeah, a former client of ours.
Yeah. And in 2016, was it 8?
I think it was 16.
17?
Yeah.
And there was not a rallying cry from our community. So I wanted to just point out this whole notion of implicit bias. We look at people of color as criminals, no matter what they're doing. And so it tends to end up that they get over surveilled and imprisoned.
Do you want to come and close out? As Jerry Ann is coming to the front of the room, I want to give her a round of applause for all the work the Black Heritage Trail does. Many thanks to the director of the Rudman Center and my colleague, John Gravy. And thank you for your time and attention. Over to you.
Well, this is just a quick exercise that we're trying for our first time. I asked you to think about what you came in knowing, what you thought about the role of race and class. And I think we did a lot of talking about class. We see that much more readily in our country than we really want to admit about class. So if you could just take a few minutes and talk to somebody next to you, around you, close to you, in a group or not, just the idea that you came with, what you think you know, what you thought you know, and if anything changed from the dialogue today.
Thank you for your energy, your enthusiasm. Thank you for visiting us here at the University of New Hampshire School of Law. And on behalf of the Rudman Center and my colleague, Professor Graby, and the Black Heritage Trail and New Hampshire Humanities, I thank you. Take this energy out and let's change the world. All right, thank you.